change in the real estate industry is constant. Now, if we go back before 1993, we can see that real estate was pretty consistent for a long period of time. When I first got into the real estate business, we were using 3-ring binders, and we got updates to our 3-ring binders. They called them errata. And we would go in, and sometimes we'd do pen and ink changes in our books. And then the new technology came out, and that was glue. And so they took the pages and they glued them together, and then they had books. And the books came out twice. Every 2 weeks we got a book. We got a book for single families, and then 2 weeks later we'd get a book for condos. So we had this alternating. We had these books, and these books had the inventory, and they were confidential, and we weren't supposed to give them away to anybody, and consumers weren't allowed to have them. And then every quarter we'd have what we called a comp book. So if we wanted to go back and look at prior sales, we could do so in a comp book. So none of this was digitized. And then around 1979, 78, 79, we got dumb terminals, where terminals tied into a major computer network, and we had thermal paper, and this was the start of the digital technologies in real estate in the 80s. Now, I was president in 1993 of the San Diego Association of Realtors. I throw this clip out there because it's very apparent, if you were paying attention at the time, that we were on the verge of something changing in the world. And I wasn't quite sure what it was, but I came up with this comment. I said, don't let the doom and gloomers get you down, because we were coming out of a recession, but I believe we were on the verge of the greatest social and economic explosion that the world had ever seen. This was in 1993. And what happened is about 1995, we started to see the dot-com bubble. And that's exactly what changed the world, changed economies, changed everything. Now, in 1993, in San Diego, we had somebody, his name was Richard Jansen, and Richard Jansen had this idea that you could put kiosks in Long's drugstores, and people could shop for houses in drugstores. Now, we needed a contract with the MLS to do this, and so he went out and got a contract with our MLS in San Diego, and I was president of the Board of Realtors, and I thought this was a great idea to let consumers see what was available. Now, if you look at this brochure, at the bottom it says Home Select Kiosk, the automated 7-minute home finder. Now, a couple of thoughts. Number one, who goes to the drugstore to look for houses? I'm not really sure. And number two, who's going to spend 7 minutes looking at it? But this was state-of-the-art. This was technology. There were 50 of these things in drugstores around San Diego County, because San Diego is a great place to experiment with new ideas. So this is what we had in 93. Now, also, in the early 90s, the National Association of Realtors was not sitting idly on their hands. They were looking at this. The MLS vendors in the real estate industry, they did a white paper. Arthur Young, a major accounting firm and consulting firm, they did a report for the National Association of Realtors. EDS, Electronic Data Systems, they did a report. Gallup did a report. And then the National Association of Realtors put together a presidential advisory group to look at all these reports and determine the future of the real estate industry. And this was in the early 1990s. So here's the MLS vendor white paper. Input to NAR business plan regarding the future of MLS, because we were concerned in the 90s about the future of MLS. And then the MLS technology, the Presidential Advisory Group, put out this report, The Future of MLS. And again, this was in the early 90s. And if you look at the charge, it says to assess the current trends in technology applications to real estate, especially as it extends to or includes MLS. Multiple listing service, information delivery systems, to make recommendations concerning what actions the realtor family should take to assure that it maintains control of MLS systems. And that was key. And if you look at the vision, that the realtor is the primary provider, distributor of all information needed by consumers in a real estate transaction. And this was the position that we took as an industry in the 90s. As the technology started to change, we decided we needed to take control of one of our most valuable assets, because nobody else had this asset, and that was the inventory of available properties for sale. And to keep the realtor central to the real estate transaction. Now this, again, a member services report put out by the National Association of Realtors. So it's very important to understand that your National Association was looking very hard at changes to the industry in the 90s and did some very bold things to move everybody forward. Now, the results of one of these studies, and you see that the study divided up realtors into three groups: established successes, young lions, and survivors. Now today we have the same thing. We don't have young lions anymore. I actually thought I was a young lion back in those days. But what we have today, we call them YPNs. We call them millennials, whatever, right? Well, we always had this distinction in the real estate industry of certain age groups of people, and this was the case in the 90s as well. And today it's the case. Now, in 1993, Billy Chi, another one of my real estate heroes, Billy Chi, who was with Prudential Locations in Hawaii, Billy Chi said famously, "The lion is coming over the hill, and realtors are like a bunch of chihuahuas arguing over the bones. And be careful, they're going to devour you." And so this was radical thinking. But at the end of Billy Chi's speech, he says, "Fellow realtors, let's become the lion. We're sitting in this position. We have the assets. We have the resources. And there's no reason that we should let the future be taken from us by outsiders." And so I'm here to tell you that NAR was right. And that you, realtors, were right about the technology, about the MLS, about the change, and about doing something about it. So the National Association of Realtors funded, as a wholly owned subsidiary, a separate corporation known as the Realtors Information Network, RIN, the Realtors Information Network. And it was set up as a separate corporation so it wouldn't get bogged down in the politics of associations. And so it was set up separately, had its own board of directors. They were funded $13 million to move this forward. Now, this is very interesting because at the time, there were only 20 million people using the web. Now, think about that. 20 million might sound like a big number. 20 million is nothing. There were only 20 million people using, this is an old slide, web economics, and you can see the economics was web traffic, eyeballs, ad placement, revenues. You know what? That's the same model that we use today to generate ad revenues on the internet. And we had browsers. As a matter of fact, the browsers were new. Netscape didn't go public till August 9th of 1995. Microsoft didn't even have a browser that people wanted to use back in those days. And we had many ways to search on the internet. We had Lycos and Yahoo and InfoSeek, different search engines. But the key point here is that there were only 20 million users. And one of our concerns was, if we put something on the World Wide Web, who's going to find it? And that was a real concern with only 20 million users. We didn't know if there'd ever be more than 20 million users, but we assumed that there would be. And so part of the rewards of volunteer work, I was volunteered at my Association of Realtors, and in 1993 I was president, and I worked with the executive officer, Walt Bukowski. Walt Bukowski today is the executive officer of the San Francisco Association of Realtors. Walt was asked to participate on the first RIN board of directors, and because I was president, it was a great move forward for Walt. And I thought if we allowed our executive officer to go out there and talk to everybody about what was going on in the country, that we in San Diego would have an advantage. And so I encouraged our executive officer to go out and to participate on that board of directors, and he did. And I asked him, I said, "Walt, someday they're going to need somebody to speak. They're going to need an evangelist. They're going to need somebody to go talk to realtors about this. And when they do, I'd like you to throw my hat in the ring." And that's exactly what Walt did. And in 1994, I was introduced to the people that were hired by the National Association of Realtors, by RIN, to work in this new entity. So I got my badge. I was hired by the National Association. We got these badges, right? No lions. Billy Chi said the lion's coming over the hill, and we're like a bunch of chihuahuas arguing over the bones. So we got badges that said no lions, and we were ready to take on the world. Now, I joined a team at that time at RIN. The team was Ed Evans, who was the president, John Schladweiler, who was in charge of the technology, Kathy Hartke's one of the brightest ladies I ever met, Jim Tebay, who was the vice president of field marketing, and the consultant at that time was a big company, Booz Allen Hamilton. So I joined this group of people. And they were not real estate people. They had come from a company called Comdesco. They didn't know anything about real estate, and I had been a broker for many years, and so they threw everything at me, and they said, "Saul, tell us how this technology is going to be used in the real estate business." So on March 4th, 1995, it's actually the day after my birthday, I did a presentation to all of the MLS executives in the country at the Drake Hotel in Chicago, where we talked about the future of MLS, of the association, of technology, and what the Realtors Information Network was going to do for technology and for realtors. Now, one of the people that we hired at RIN was a fellow named Bob Goldberg. Now, this is actually an old picture of Bob Goldberg. You might recognize Bob. He's the current Chief Executive Officer of the National Association of Realtors. Well, when they hired him at RIN, he had to have somebody explain to him what was going on. What were these projects? And the only person that really knew deeply about what was going on was me. So Bob got assigned to me for training, for mentorship, for something. I'm glad to say that he's now running the National Association of Realtors. And so Bob's job was to go out and find out how we could effectively market to the real estate industry. And so a RIN Network Desktop was created. And so this was, you see, a RIN Network Desktop Release 1A. This is what it looked like. This is how we loaded it. Remember these little floppy disks? It took 3 of them, but the first rendition of this took like 15 disks that you had to load on your computer. So you could then have access to a proprietary network. Now remember, we're talking about all of this was developed in 1995 for realtors, and what the realtor family determined was what we really needed was a proprietary network, a closed network. As a matter of fact, people are talking about closed networks today. But we knew in 1995 we needed a closed network. So this was the original RIN Network Desktop. And you can see that there were many choices that realtors who applied and used this system had. First intro, kind of tell you about it. Mail, that was a closed system. It wasn't like the kind of email we have today. It was closed email. As a matter of fact, you send an email, if you wanted to draw it, bring it back, you could actually bring it back, because until somebody opened it, they hadn't seen it. There was an area called Discuss, which my business partners, John Riley, Mike Barnett, and myself were in charge of. We were in charge of that button, and that button was the community button, where we established the first online communities in real estate. And then there was a library, and that connected to the National Association of Realtors library and journal and news, because we had group subscriptions to the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and those sorts of things. And then something called geodata that I'm going to come back to, and you could do shopping online, and this was all in a closed network, or a lookup, which was like a search. And then there was this thing called home ads, and we're going to get the home ads, but what exactly was that? And then there was a button, because remember, this was a proprietary network. You could click on that button and it would take you out to the web, right? Take you outside of that network. Now, if you remember, how did we connect to the internet in those days? It was through telephone lines. You had to find a telephone line. You had to plug a telephone line into your computer. Now, you had to make sure that telephone line was hot. I used to lick the line. If it shocked my tongue, I knew it was good, and I would plug it into my computer, and then I could dial up. And you see, if I wanted to hang up, I have to click the button that says hang up, because it was all done over telephone line. So this is the RIN Network Desktop. The idea was to be able to handle everything you need to handle online in a closed environment. Now, I'll go back to that button, geodata, because that button, geodata, that was accumulating as much data as possible, and this is what geodata looked like. And you can see that RIN was about connecting all of these databases: crime, environment, thematic, taxes and deeds and school data, community data, foreclosure, demographics, reverse directories. Remember those? Now, those are all databases. RIN was going to hook all those up, and we called it geodata. And if you look at this, you might recognize that we have something today called RPR. And RPR is just the evolution of the original concept of geodata from the Realtors Information Network, from RIN. Now, also, the Realtors Information Network created something called DXM, Data Exchange Method, a data dictionary. Now, here was the problem. Every MLS in the country had different vendors, and those vendors didn't all speak the same language. And so if somebody wanted to bring all that data together, it couldn't. If a software developer wanted to develop something like Top Producer, which was the first big real estate CRM, it would have to be developed separately for each MLS, because each language was different, and that made it costly for realtors. So if we could somehow normalize that data, then we could have better software, less expensive software. It was the right thing to do. The way we were going to do it was something called DXM, or a data dictionary. And of course, RIN kind of fell off the table in 1996. And when RPR decided a couple years ago that they wanted to figure out how to bring this together, you know the methodology that they determined was the best way to do this? A data dictionary. And so, again, the things that we created back in the 90s are still applicable and in use today. Now, here's another button, discuss. We made discuss, we actually gave it a name, and in later versions it didn't say discuss, it said Real Talk. And Real Talk was the first online real estate community